The orbital station smelled wrong. That was Eric Dalton's first coherent thought as he stepped through the airlock, and he immediately felt ridiculous for thinking it. The Valtherus had mastered atmospheric processors centuries before humanity figured out the wheel, yet here he was, a representative of Earth's finest, mentally complaining about air quality like a tourist with a sensitive nose. "Commander Dalton," the protocol officer beside him murmured, a young lieutenant named Shaw who'd spent the entire journey from Earth reviewing Valtherus etiquette with the desperate intensity of a student cramming for finals. "Remember, 3 beats before responding to any formal address. Eye contact is considered aggressive in ceremonial contexts, and whatever you do, don't comment on anyone's ears." Their ears. Apparently it's like commenting on someone's nose, deeply personal, maybe sexual. The cultural database wasn't clear. Eric suppressed a smile. 6 months of preparation, 43 briefing documents, and humanity's diplomatic corps still wasn't sure if ear commentary qualified as small talk or harassment. They were so magnificently unprepared for this, and somehow he'd been chosen to stumble through it anyway. The corridor opened into something his brain struggled to categorize. Calling it a hall seemed inadequate. Calling it a cathedral seemed presumptuous. The space simply existed in a way that made human architecture feel like a child's crayon sketch. Light moved through it like a living thing, pooling in corners, streaming across surfaces that might have been metal or crystal or something without an English name. Gravity felt negotiable here, as if the station were politely suggesting down rather than insisting on it. And the Valtherus themselves, dozens of them, arranged in what had to be carefully choreographed positions, though Eric couldn't decode the pattern, were genuinely stunning. Tall, most of them, with that characteristic fluid grace that made human movement look mechanical by comparison. Their ears rose to elegant points, some adorned with precious metals that caught the strange light, others bare and somehow more striking for it. They wore their achievements like visible auras. A warrior with a scar bisecting one eyebrow stood with the coiled stillness of contained violence. A diplomat's robes shifted colors subtly with her breathing. A scholar had eyes that seemed to track calculations in the air itself. "They're all really attractive," Eric whispered to Shaw. "Did we know they were going to be this attractive? Is that going to be a problem?" The cultural database did note that Valtherus aesthetics tend toward, "Commander, you're supposed to be counting beats." Right, 3 beats. Eric had already forgotten what question he was supposed to be not answering. An older Valtherus male stepped forward, his robe suggesting significant rank through a complexity of embroidery that Eric's eyes couldn't quite follow. When he spoke, the translation implant behind Eric's ear rendered it into English with only a slight delay, though something in the cadence felt lost. "Commander Eric Dalton of Earth, we welcome you to Meridian's crown. The selection ceremony is an ancient tradition, honored across 500 generations of our people. Through your choice today, you will bind your world to ours in a partnership of cultural exchange and mutual understanding. The individual you select will serve as liaison, guide, and representative of Valtherus interests within human space. This is not a decision of politics but of instinct. You must choose with your heart, not your strategic mind." "No pressure then," Eric muttered, and Shaw made a small wounded sound beside him. But there was pressure, immense pressure, the weight of representing an entire species that had only just been invited to the galactic table. Earth needed this alliance. The Valtherus Empire controlled trade routes, technology, resources that could transform human civilization. And Eric, selected for his tactical record and his supposed diplomatic instincts, which as far as he could tell meant he didn't actively insult people during staff meetings, was supposed to choose correctly. He walked slowly past the assembled candidates, aware of dozens of eyes tracking his movement. Each Valtherus maintained their position with perfect poise, and Eric felt increasingly like he was selecting produce at a very intimidating farmer's market. The warrior nodded minutely as he passed, radiating controlled power. The diplomat smiled with calculated warmth. A scientist type didn't acknowledge him at all, absorbed in something displayed on the palm of her hand. And then at the periphery, almost hidden behind a decorative column that pulsed with soft bioluminescence, he saw her. She was smaller than the others, though still taller than Eric's own 5'10". Where the other Valthyris held themselves like exclamation points, she seemed to be apologizing for occupying space. Her ceremonial robes, the same style as the others but somehow less impressive on her slight frame, hung loose, and her long ears drooped slightly, giving her an expression of perpetual worry. She wasn't looking at him. She was very deliberately not looking at anything, staring at the floor with an intensity that suggested she was trying to will herself through it. Eric stopped walking. There was something about her that resonated with a frequency he recognized. He'd seen it in veterans after too many tour, that particular quality of being tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. The way she held herself suggested someone who'd learned to make themselves small to avoid attention, to survive by not being noticed. Her, he said, before his tactical mind could interfere. The silence was profound. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of shock, thick enough to feel physical. Shaw grabbed his elbow hard enough to leave bruises. "Commander," Shaw hissed, "that's we need to, you should reconsider." But Eric was watching the young woman's reaction, and it wasn't what he expected. She didn't look pleased or honored or excited. She looked resigned, the way someone looks when they've been dreading something inevitable and it's finally arrived. Her eyes, pale gray, almost silver, lifted to meet his for just a moment, and in them he saw something vast and old and unspeakably sad before she dropped her gaze again. The elder Valthyris who'd welcomed him cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to contain entire conversations. "You have selected Lyra Keith. This choice is unexpected, but it is made and it will be honored." He paused, then added in a tone Eric couldn't quite read, "May your instincts prove wiser than they appear, Commander." Lyra stepped forward with the mechanical movement of someone following a script they'd memorized, but never wanted to perform. She bowed too deeply, Eric thought, almost folding herself in half, and spoke for the first time in a voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "I am honored by your selection, Commander Dalton. I will serve as best I am able. Please forgive any inadequacies in my performance." Shaw was still gripping his elbow. Around them, the assembled Valthyris had begun moving, the ceremony apparently concluded, but their movements seemed too careful, too controlled. Several were whispering behind raised hands. The warrior he'd passed earlier was staring at Lyra with an expression Eric definitely recognized, the way soldiers looked at unexploded ordnance. "Did I just make a terrible mistake?" Eric asked Shaw quietly. "I have absolutely no idea, sir, but I think we're going to find out." Lyra had been aboard the Terrence for 3 weeks, and Eric still wasn't sure if she actually lived in her quarters or simply haunted them. She moved through the ship like a whisper, appearing suddenly in doorways and apologizing for existing before anyone had noticed her arrival. The crew had started calling her the Ghost, though never where she might hear it, and Eric had to admit the nickname fit. "Coffee," he offered one morning in the mess hall, finding her standing near the beverage dispensers with the uncertain posture of someone who wasn't sure if they were allowed to use them. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. I mean, if it's not too much trouble. But really, I shouldn't impose on your supplies. It's coffee, not liquid gold." "Well, actually, given what Earth pays for decent beans these days, maybe it is liquid gold. But we have plenty." Eric poured 2 cups and handed her one before she could construct another elaborate refusal. "Milk, sugar, the blood of your enemies." She blinked at him, then a small smile flickered across her face. "Just black, thank you. I find the bitterness clarifying, and I've been trying to reduce my enemy blood intake. My physician says it's terrible for cholesterol." Eric laughed, startled. It was the first joke he'd heard from her, delivered in that same soft, apologetic tone she used for everything else, which somehow made it funnier. They sat at one of the tables bolted to the floor, a necessary design feature that still looked awkward to Eric's Earth-trained eyes. Lyra wrapped both hands around her cup as if drawing warmth from it, though the ship's environmental systems maintained a perfectly comfortable temperature. Her ears drooped slightly, the left one bearing a small notch near the tip that he'd noticed before but never mentioned, remembering Shaw's frantic warning about ear commentary. "How are you settling in?" Eric asked, then immediately felt stupid. She'd been tiptoeing around the ship like a nervous cat for 3 weeks. Obviously, she wasn't settled. "Everyone has been very kind," Lyra said carefully. "Your crew is remarkably patient with my questions. Lieutenant Chen explained the concept of Casual Friday to me yesterday, and I'm still not entirely certain I understand it. You make your clothing less formal to celebrate the approach of days when you don't work, but then you dress formally again on the day you're not working. When you put it that way, it does sound insane. But most cultural practices do, examined from outside. The Valthyris have a holiday where we throw fruit at government buildings to commemorate an ancient tax protest. Context makes anything reasonable." Eric tried to imagine Lyra throwing fruit at anything and failed completely. She seemed like someone who would apologize to furniture for bumping into it, which, now that he thought about it, he'd actually witnessed her do twice. The mess hall door opened and Chief Engineer Rodriguez entered, spotted them, and changed course toward their table. Eric had known Rodriguez for 5 years, served with her on 2 previous missions, and could read her moods like a ship's diagnostic panel. Right now she was curious and trying to hide it. "Commander, Lyra." Rodriguez nodded to each of them. "Lyra, I wanted to thank you for that suggestion about the coolant flow yesterday. We implemented it and efficiency jumped by 6%. Where'd you learn about human engineering systems?" Lyra's ears flattened slightly against her head. "Oh, I just noticed the sound was irregular when I walked past. I didn't mean to overstep. I should have kept my observations to myself. Please accept my apology for the intrusion." "That wasn't, I was thanking you, not criticizing. 6% is massive." Rodriguez glanced at Eric with an expression that clearly said we need to talk later, then excused herself. Eric waited until she'd left before speaking. "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Apologize for things that aren't problems, for things that are actually helpful." Lyra stared into her coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions she hadn't asked. "It's easier than the alternative." "Which is?" "Being noticed." Before Eric could pursue that peculiar statement, his comm unit chirped with the tone that meant someone needed him on the bridge immediately. He excused himself, leaving Lyra alone with her coffee and her determination to occupy as little space as possible. The bridge was small by military standards, efficient by human ones, and probably adorable by Valthyris measures. Shaw met him at the command station with a datapad and an expression Eric had learned to dread. "We have a situation. The Valthyris delegation wants to schedule a strategic planning session. Tomorrow, 1400 hours. They've specifically requested that Lyra not attend." "Why?" "They didn't say. But their cultural liaison, the tall one with the silver earrings who looks like she could kill you with a stern glance, implied that Lyra's presence would be counterproductive to frank discussion." Eric felt something prickle at the back of his neck, the instinct that had kept him alive through 3 border conflicts and 2 first-contact scenarios gone wrong. That's the first time they've excluded her from anything. "I know, it's irregular, but maybe they just want to discuss things that require, actual strategic input. No offense to Lyra, but she hasn't exactly been contributing in meetings." That was true. Lyra attended every session, sat perfectly still in her designated chair, and said nothing unless directly addressed. Even then, her answers were brief, carefully neutral, and usually phrased as suggestions rather than statements. But Eric had started noticing something else. After meetings where Lyra had been present, the Valthyris delegation's positions would shift in subtle ways, always moving closer to terms favorable to Earth. At first he'd attributed it to his own negotiating skills, but the pattern was too consistent. "Set up the meeting," Eric said slowly, "but I want you to pay attention to something. Compare the outcomes of sessions with Lyra present versus sessions without her. Run the analytics." Shaw's eyebrows rose. "You think she's influencing negotiations somehow?" "I think I don't know nearly enough about what's happening on my own ship, and that bothers me." The next day's meeting went poorly, which was to say it went exactly as well as every interstellar negotiation Eric had ever witnessed. Lots of formal language, careful positioning, and absolutely nothing concrete accomplished. The Valthyris wanted concessions on mining rights. Earth wanted technology transfers. Both sides wanted guarantees neither could provide. By the time the session ended, Eric had a headache building behind his eyes and a new appreciation for why diplomats drank. He found Lyra in the observation deck, a bubble of transparent material that offered a view of the stars unfiltered by the ship's hull. She was standing very still, hands clasped behind her back, staring out at the vast nothing with an expression he couldn't read. "You could have attended," Eric said, joining her at the viewport. "I would have overruled their request." "I know, thank you for not doing so. Sometimes absence is more useful than presence." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying they don't want you there." "They're afraid of me." She said it simply, without emotion, as if reporting the weather. Eric waited, but she didn't elaborate. Outside, a small vessel passed in the distance, its running lights blinking in the regulation pattern for civilian traffic. Closer to the viewport, he could see Lyra's reflection ghosted over the stars, her expression distant and sad. "The mining negotiations," Lyra said quietly. "Sectors 7 and 9 in the Kepler belt. Those are what they're actually concerned about, not the asteroid clusters they keep mentioning. If you offer to exclude those two sectors from initial surveys, they'll concede on the technology transfers. But you should ask for the medical database as well, not just the manufacturing specifications. They'll refuse twice, then agree on the third request." Eric turned to look at her directly. "How do you know that?" "The delegation leader, Ambassador Thren, touches his left ear when he's protecting something important. His second, Kale, watches the door during discussions of medical technology. She's worried about information security. And their junior analyst reviewed asteroid survey data 17 times during the last meeting, but only highlighted the decoy locations. Basic observation." "That's not basic observation, that's reading minds." "No," Lyra said softly, still watching the stars. "That's just paying attention when people think you're not worth noticing. I've had a lot of practice at being overlooked, Commander. It's remarkable what people reveal when they believe no one important is watching." Something in her tone made Eric's chest tighten. Before he could respond, alarms began shrieking throughout the ship, and the stars outside the viewport suddenly streaked with weapon fire. The bridge erupted into controlled chaos, crew members moving to stations with the practiced efficiency of people who drilled for this exact scenario, and desperately hoped they'd never need to use it. Eric was running before his conscious mind caught up, Lyra's footsteps whisper-soft behind him despite the crisis. "Report," Eric barked, sliding into the command chair while his heart tried to hammer its way through his ribcage. "3 vessels, Crimson Tide markings," Rodriguez called from tactical. "They dropped out of hyperspace at close range. Someone fed them our exact coordinates. Shields holding at 87%, but they're targeting propulsion systems, not weapons. They want us disabled, not dead." "How thoughtful of them," Eric muttered. "Return fire pattern Delta. Come, get me the Valthyris delegation." "Already tried, sir. They're not responding. Their section of the ship just went into lockdown." "Of course it did." Eric pulled up the tactical display, watching 3 angry red dots dance around the Terrence's position with the kind of precision that spoke to military training and expensive hardware. The Crimson Tide was a radical faction within the Valthyris Empire, purists who thought the galaxy would be better off without younger species cluttering it up. Earth had been warned about them during the initial briefings, somewhere between the information about dining etiquette and the 15-page document on proper pronoun usage. "They're hailing us," Shaw said, her voice tight. "Put them through." The face that appeared on the main screen belonged to a Valtharis male, who'd clearly missed the memo about peaceful coexistence. Scar tissue twisted one side of his face into a permanent sneer, and his ears had been cropped short in what Eric's cultural database unhelpfully informed him was either a sign of military service or criminal punishment, possibly both. "Human vessel Terrence, you are harboring contaminated goods. Surrender the pale mistake and withdraw your petition for alliance. Your species is unworthy of galactic society, and your choice in the selection ceremony proves your judgment is fatally flawed." "I appreciate the feedback," Eric said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. "But we're going to decline your generous offer and instead suggest you go foo." A hit rocked the ship hard enough to throw standing crew members into their stations. Somewhere in the lower decks, metal screamed in protest. The lights flickered, went red, then stabilized at emergency levels. "Direct hit to engineering," Rodriguez shouted. "Shields at 42%. Hull breach on Deck 3, sealing now. Casualties reported in medical bay, structural collapse, at least 3 crew members trapped." Eric's mind raced through options, discarding them as quickly as they formed. The Terrence was a diplomatic vessel with minimal armament, built for looking peaceful rather than fighting. Against 3 military-grade ships, they had minutes at best before complete systems failure. "I should go," Lyra said quietly beside him, and Eric realized she'd followed him onto the bridge, was standing just behind his chair like a ghost at a funeral. "Go where?" "Lyra, get to the emergency shelters." "To medical bay." "I can help with the injured." Another impact, harder this time. The ship groaned like a living thing in pain. On the tactical display, one of the Crimson Tide vessels was moving into position for what looked like a kill shot on the main engines. "Fine, go, but take security with you," Shaw assigned someone. But Lyra was already moving toward the exit, and Shaw was too busy coordinating damage control to follow up. Eric forced his attention back to the immediate problem of not dying in the next 5 minutes. Reroute power from life support in unoccupied sections. Buy us 10% more on shields. And someone find out why the Valtharis delegation is playing hide and seek while we're under attack by their own people. In the medical bay, chaos had evolved into organized panic. The structural collapse had brought down a support beam, trapping Lieutenant Morrison and 2 engineers beneath twisted metal. The ship's doctor, an unflappable woman named Akafer who'd served on colony ships during the expansion, was directing 2 orderlies in setting up emergency triage while simultaneously treating a crew member with a nasty head wound. Lyra appeared in the doorway like a materialization, took in the scene with one sweeping glance, and moved immediately to the trapped crew members. Morrison was conscious, cursing steadily in 3 languages, which Akafer had taught the staff was a positive sign in trauma cases. "Don't suppose you have super strength hidden under those robes," Morrison grunted as Lyra knelt beside him. "Regrettably, no, but I'm reasonably good at geometry and load-bearing calculations." Lyra studied the collapsed beam, her fingers tracing along its length without quite touching it. "If we apply pressure here and here simultaneously while rotating the beam 7 degrees counterclockwise, the weight distribution should shift enough to allow extraction. We'll need 3 people and something to use as a lever. We need cutting equipment and an engineering team," one of the orderlies protested. "That beam weighs half a ton." "We have neither time nor equipment," Lyra said, still in that soft, apologetic tone that somehow carried absolute certainty. "Dr. Akafer, if you could position yourself here. And you," she nodded to the orderly, "here. I'll take the primary leverage point." They moved into position more out of desperation than confidence. Lyra wrapped her hands around a piece of torn metal, braced her feet against the deck plating, and closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering herself. On three, she said. 1, 2, 3. They pushed. The beam shouldn't have moved. Physics said it was impossible with 3 people and improvised leverage. But it did move, grinding against the deck with a sound like a dying machine, rotating exactly 7 degrees while Morrison and the engineers scrambled free. "How did you?" the orderly started, staring at Lyra with something between confusion and awe. "Favorable angles and desperation," Lyra said quickly, already moving to help Akafar with the injured. "Sometimes the universe cooperates when you ask politely." On the bridge, the universe was decidedly not cooperating. The Terrence's shields were failing, weapons systems were offline, and the Crimson Tide ships were closing for what would definitely be the final assault. Eric had exhausted every tactical option in his repertoire, and was now into the territory of desperate improvisation and prayer to deities he didn't believe in. "Sir," Shaw said quietly, "if we're going down, I just want you to know that your speech at the Academy graduation was genuinely inspiring, even though you were clearly hungover." "Thanks, Shaw, that's weirdly comforting. Also, I borrowed your dress uniform jacket last year and spilled coffee on it. The one you thought got damaged in transit. Less comforting, but I appreciate the deathbed confession." The Crimson Tide commander appeared on screen again, his scarred face arranged in what might have been satisfaction. "Last chance, humans. Surrender the pale mistake or be destroyed. Your choice demonstrates why your species will never." Lyra walked onto the bridge. Not hurried, not running, just walking with that same apologetic posture she always carried. But something had changed. The air felt different around her, charged with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. Her eyes had gone distant, focused on something beyond the visible spectrum. "Commander Dalton," she said, and her voice was different too, still quiet but with an undertone that resonated in the bones. "I need to make a communication. It will be brief. Do you trust me?" Every instinct Eric had developed over 15 years of military service was screaming that something profound was happening, that this moment would define everything that came after. Lyra stood there, fragile and apologetic and waiting for his answer, while around them the ship died by degrees and the crew held their collective breath. "Yes," Eric said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Shaw, give her access to communications." Lyra moved to the comm station, her fingers dancing across controls she shouldn't have known how to operate. She opened a channel on a frequency that made the equipment whine in protest, then spoke 7 words in a language that hurt to hear, each syllable carrying weight that pressed against reality itself. Then she folded her hands, looked at Eric with those sad, ancient eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry. I tried so hard not to be noticed." Outside the viewport, space began to tear open like fabric, and through the wounds in reality, something vast and terrible started to arrive. The ships that emerged from hyperspace didn't arrive so much as manifest, as if they'd always been there and reality was only just catching up to the fact. 17 vessels, each one carrying the markings of the Valtharis Imperial Sovereign Fleet, warships that Eric had only seen in classified intelligence briefings, the kind of hardware that ended conflicts by simply appearing. The Crimson Tide ships didn't even attempt to fight. They scattered like startled fish, their engines screaming as they pushed toward the hyperspace threshold with the desperation of people who just realized they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Well," Shaw said into the stunned silence, "that happened." The lead Imperial ship was hailing them, and Eric nodded for Shaw to open the channel with hands that weren't quite steady. The face that appeared on screen belonged to a Valtharis admiral whose reputation Eric knew from intelligence reports. Keth Voran, the Hammer of the Outer Reaches, a military commander who'd pacified 3 systems and negotiated 2 peace treaties in that order. The admiral was kneeling, not standing at attention, not offering a formal bow, but kneeling with his head bowed and his hands pressed flat against what Eric assumed was the deck of his own bridge. Behind him, every visible crew member had assumed the same position. "Keenth," the admiral said, and the translation implant rendered it with a notation Eric had never seen before: untranslatable, imperial absolute. We come at your word. Command us. Lyra was trembling, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She looked smaller than ever, like she was trying to compress herself out of existence through sheer force of will. Please rise, Admiral Voren, she said softly. There's no need for such formality. I only called because people were in danger. I didn't mean to invoke the old protocols. The protocols exist regardless of intention, Keith. Your word carries weight beyond meaning. This is known. Eric's tactical mind was trying to process what he was seeing, while his instincts screamed that he'd fundamentally misunderstood everything about the past 3 weeks. Beside him, Rodriguez had pulled up information on her datapad and gone very pale. Commander, Rodriguez whispered, I'm reading energy signatures from Lyra that shouldn't be possible. Her neural activity is interfacing with the comm system on frequencies we can't generate. She's not using the equipment, she's becoming part of it. On screen, Admiral Voren was still kneeling, waiting for Lyra to say something that would release him from whatever ancient obligation her 7 words had triggered. The rest of the bridge crew was staring at Lyra with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning terror. I release you from formal observance, Lyra said, each word careful and precise. Please consider this situation resolved and return to your regular duties. Thank you for your timely assistance. The Admiral rose slowly, his scarred face unreadable. As you command, but Keith, the galaxy will know you've spoken. After 3 centuries of silence, your voice has been heard. There will be questions. I know, Lyra said, and she sounded exhausted. I know. The channel closed. The Imperial ships held position for another 30 seconds, a show of force and protection that made the Terrans look like a child's toy by comparison. Then began their departure sequence, folding back into hyperspace with the same impossible grace they'd arrived with. The bridge remained silent for a long moment, everyone carefully not looking at Lyra, who seemed to be trying to disappear into the deck plating through sheer willpower. So, Eric said finally, because someone had to say something, and apparently it was going to be him. That was interesting. I can explain, Lyra said quickly, her voice back to its normal apologetic register. I should have explained earlier. I meant to explain. I tried to find the right time, but there never seemed to be a good moment to mention that my family used to be, that there's some historical context that's relevant to. Take a breath, Eric said gently. Shaw, get medical teams to handle the wounded. Rodriguez, damage assessment. Everyone else, let's secure the ship and make sure we're actually safe before we have the conversation about what just happened. It took 2 hours to stabilize the Terrans. The Valtharis delegation emerged from lockdown looking shaken, offered their assistance with repairs with unusual humility, and avoided looking at Lyra entirely. Medical reported all injured crew members stable, with Morrison loudly proclaiming that he'd been saved by the tiny diplomat with the magic geometry, until painkillers made him stop making sense entirely. Eric found Lyra in her quarters, sitting on the edge of her bunk with the posture of someone awaiting execution. Her quarters were almost aggressively sparse, regulation furniture, no personal items, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. It looked like a stage set for the concept of temporary residence. I'm not going to pretend I understand what happened, Eric said, leaning against the doorframe because sitting felt too formal and standing felt too aggressive. But I'd like to, if you're willing to explain. Lyra's ears drooped so low they were nearly horizontal. I'm Keith, last of the Keith bloodline, though saying it that way makes it sound more impressive than it is. My family used to govern a sector of space before the current Valtharis Empire existed. We had a particular ability, a genetic quirk, really, that let us interface with certain fundamental forces. We could affect quantum probabilities, manipulate energy states, communicate across distances that shouldn't allow communication. We weren't gods, just people with a biological advantage that became dangerous when the galaxy got crowded and complicated. That's why the Admiral called you by a title the translator couldn't handle. Keith isn't really a name, it's more like a designation, a warning label. My ancestors recognized that their power was incompatible with a diverse, democratic galactic civilization. You can't have meaningful democracy when one family can whisper commands that reality has trouble refusing. So they withdrew. Most took their own lives in a coordinated act of responsibility. My mother hid me, raised me in isolation, taught me to suppress what I was. Lyra's hands twisted in her lap. I've spent 300 years making myself small, forgettable, harmless. I thought if I came with you, to a species too new to know what I represented, I could finally be ordinary. Eric processed that, trying to reconcile the image of an enormously powerful being with the woman who apologized to furniture. 300 years. We age slowly. I'm sorry I didn't mention it. It seemed rude to bring up during small talk. Lyra, you just saved my ship and my crew by speaking 7 words that made the most powerful military force in the sector show up and kneel. I think we're past worrying about conversational etiquette. A small smile flickered across her face. You're taking this remarkably well. I'm having a quiet breakdown internally, but my therapist says I'm good at compartmentalizing. Eric moved into the room properly, sat on the deck with his back against the wall so she wouldn't have to look up at him. Why did you let me choose you in the selection ceremony? Because you looked tired. Because you chose based on instinct instead of strategy, which meant you might understand wanting to be something other than what you were bred to be. And because I thought if anyone discovered what I was, a new species might be less likely to try to use me as a weapon. Were you right? Lyra considered that seriously. You're asking me if I trust you after I've revealed the thing I've spent centuries hiding. I think the answer is yes, or I wouldn't have called the fleet. I would have let us all die rather than expose myself. But you gave me coffee and made jokes and treated me like a person instead of a strategic asset. That matters more than you know. Eric thought about the past weeks, about Lyra's careful observations and quiet competence, her humor that emerged when she felt safe, the way she'd saved Morrison without hesitation despite trying so hard to remain unnoticed. He thought about his own exhaustion with the performance of command, the weight of representing an entire species, the relief of talking to someone who seemed to understand the burden of being more than yourself. I have a proposal, he said. You continue as our cultural liaison. You continue being exactly as helpful or unhelpful as you want to be. You drink coffee, make geometry jokes, and occasionally save our lives when absolutely necessary. And in return, we pretend you're exactly as ordinary as you've been pretending to be for 3 centuries. The galaxy knows now, Lyra said softly. Admiral Voran was right. After 300 years of silence, the Keith spoke. There will be questions, demands, people who want to use what I am. Then they'll have to go through Earth's diplomatic corps, which, as we've established, is magnificently unprepared for galactic politics but very protective of our people. Eric stood, offered his hand. You're part of my crew now, that means something. Lyra looked at his hand for a long moment, then took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her grip was warm and surprisingly strong. Thank you, she said, for choosing poorly in the selection ceremony. Best terrible decision I ever made. 2 weeks later, the Terrans limped into the repair station with a full damage report. 3 formal diplomatic protests from the Crimson Tide's political opponents, and 17 requests for meetings with Lyra from various galactic powers, all of which she politely declined. Eric found her in the observation deck again, watching stars with that same distant expression, but when he joined her she smiled, genuine and unforced. I've been thinking, Lyra said. Your culture has this concept of nicknames, informal designations based on personality rather than function. Dangerous territory. The crew's been calling you the Ghost. I know I find it oddly comforting. She paused. Would it be acceptable if I asked you to simply call me Lyra? Not Keith, not a title, just the name my mother gave me when I was small and the galaxy hadn't yet decided what I should be. I've been calling you Lyra this whole time. I know, she said again, and her smile widened. That's why I asked.